What's happening? Good to have you all here for our lecture, Unit 2, Day 5 homework on neurotransmitters and drugs. So what we're going to do is talk about what neurotransmitters do, how they work. We've talked about them when we went over how neurons fire. We're going to talk about specific neurotransmitters, then talk about what drugs do to neurotransmitters. The reason why drugs do what they do is because of how they affect neurotransmitters. So we'll talk about that, specific categories of drugs, and then how addiction works in the brain, okay? Remember, this whole unit is about our biology, about our body. So we're diving into the way that the chemicals in our brain and body impact the way that we function, okay? So neurotransmitters. We've used this word before, but what exactly is a neurotransmitter? It's the chemical in the brain, neuro, right? That means brain. The messenger in the brain, the chemical that either makes neurons fire, we call that to be excitatory, to activate neurons, or these chemicals slow neurons down, inhibit the firing of neurons. They're either excitatory or inhibitory, okay? So we have a presynaptic neuron over here. These little chemicals get released from the terminal button, and then they latch on to the dendrites in the postsynaptic neuron, okay? Presynaptic before the synapse, postsynaptic after the synapse. So these chemicals, their whole job is to get released from these little bubbles into the synapse after a neuron fires and make the next neuron fire, okay? So after they are released, they bind to, well, what part of the neuron receives? The dendrites receive. So they're released from the terminal into this space, and then they bind to the dendrites on the postsynaptic neuron. That's what neurotransmitters do. They make neurons fire. They impact neurons. This is an awesome little graphic here. All right, if you look closely, okay, we have a little action potential. We have a little spark come down the axon. Wait for it, there it is. A little spark comes down the axon. It makes these neurotransmitters release into the synapse, and then look at the little red neurotransmitters. They bind to the dendrite down here. I love this graphic so much. Look at the little yellow spark. It releases the little red bubbles, and they bind to that next neuron to make that next neuron fire. That's what neurotransmitters do, okay? So what happens when neurotransmitters are done doing what they do? Well, they go back to their home. We call this reuptake. If you will, circle, put a star by reuptake. Reuptake, after they do their job, they go back to their home, they go back to their little bubbles, okay? Now, some chemicals, some drugs inhibit reuptake. This is so important. The word inhibit means to slow or to stop. Reuptake inhibitors are a special kind of drug we'll talk about in a second, but they slow down reuptake, which means those neurotransmitters, they don't go back to their home. They keep bouncing around in the synapse, making neurons fire more and more and more, okay? Sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad. It depends on which chemical is being targeted. So let's talk about the specific chemicals, the specific neurotransmitters. We're gonna go from like most important, the ones that are most likely to ask about on your test and the AP exam, all the way down to the least likely. I think there's 7 neurotransmitters that we're gonna cover. So number 1, dopamine. Probably the most important neurotransmitter. Put a star by it. We're going to talk about it a lot today. And here's some things dopamine does. If you have too much dopamine in your brain, this could be a cause of schizophrenia. If you have too little dopamine in your brain, this can result in Parkinson's, okay? Any kind of addiction is caused by the dopamine pathway in your brain because dopamine makes you feel pleasure. It makes you feel good. Some people call it the anticipation neurotransmitter. When you are looking forward to an event or to seeing a particular person, dopamine gets released in your brain, and that's how addictions form. It's the anticipation of that pleasure. Serotonin, probably number 2 in terms of importance. Serotonin is in charge of what I call the 3 S's. It helps you feel sleepy. It helps you feel satiated. Satiety means you feel full. The word saturated means to be full. So satiety, serotonin makes you feel full. It also makes you feel satisfied. It makes you feel good, okay? Technically, the only things in the world you actually enjoy, serotonin and dopamine, are the two chemicals that make you feel good, okay? Now, I mentioned a second ago, I said we're going to talk about reuptake inhibitors, okay? Put a star by this phrase, SSRIs. SSRIs are serotonin, technically, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, okay? Meaning if you take an antidepressant, okay, it might be because your serotonin levels are low. So serotonin is not making neurons fire as much. So you would take an antidepressant, an SSRI, that when the serotonin gets released into the synapse, instead of the serotonin going back into its home, the serotonin, it cannot go back to its home. Reuptake has been inhibited, so the serotonin keeps bouncing around in your synapses, which means the serotonin keeps making your happy neurons fire. It makes you less depressed. Antidepressants, because there's more serotonin in your system. Okay? Number 3, endorphins. Technically, that word endorphin, endo means within. Orphan comes from the root, this orphan comes from the root for morphine. Endorphins are like inner morphine. Well, what does morphine do for you? Makes you feel good. It makes you specifically not feel pain. Okay, so endorphins are like opiates. Okay, they're the pain relievers in the body. If you've ever had a really good workout, okay, and you just felt so good, you knew that your body should be exhausted, but you just felt so good. It's because of the endorphins in your body. Okay, when you get a hug, when you hold hands with someone that you like, your body releases endorphins. It makes you actually feel better. You feel less pain. Okay. Now, the problem, we'll talk about opiates here in a second, but the reason why opiates are so addictive is because your body loves it when it doesn't feel pain. So we'll talk about that when we talk about drugs here in a minute. Number 4, epinephrine, also known as norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline or noradrenaline, released from the adrenal glands. We talked about that with the endocrine system. But epinephrine is the stress chemical. The phrase, the fight or flight response, it's like when there's a bear or when there's a threat, you got 2 options. You can fight it or you can run as fast as you can. Either way, your sympathetic nervous system is going to need to be activated. That's what norepinephrine does. These are probably the 4 most important neurotransmitters. Some other ones that you may need to know about. Acetylcholine. Hard to say. Try it. Practice it. I know you're home or whatever, but acetylcholine. Put it together. Acetylcholine. The A in acetylcholine reminds me that if you don't have enough of this, it can cause Alzheimer's disease. And if you look on the right here, we have a normal brain activity. Yellow and red are good. A person with Alzheimer's, their brain activity, see how much less yellow and red there are? So when acetylcholine is low, it impacts your muscles, your somatic system, so your skeletal system as well. It impacts attention. There's another A word you can circle. And the big one here is memory is impacted by acetylcholine. So nicotine, people who smoke, nicotine is actually it mimics an agonist for acetylcholine. We'll talk about what that means. Number 6, glutamate is the most famous excitatory neurotransmitter. Mr. Jones, what does that mean? Well, remember, excitatory means that it activates neurons in your brain, okay? So glutamate is in charge of you learning. It's in charge of your memory. So the way I remember this is when you meet your soul mate for the first time, you're going to be excited. You're going to remember them, and you are going to learn as much about them as possible. Glutamate would help you with those things. It's excitatory. It helps you remember, and it helps you learn. The last one, GABA. GABA, I call it the ironic neurotransmitter, the hipster neurotransmitter, because it's all capital letters. GABA, it stands for this long chemical you don't need to know. But GABA is ironic because even though it's all capital letters, it's actually an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's not excitatory, even though it's all caps. It's inhibitory, right? Meaning it calms you down. And if you look on the right here, it may be tough to see, but these are 10 things that supposedly GABA does for the body to help calm you. It includes reducing anxiety and depression, helping you lose weight, helping you sleep better, helping you focus more. Some people love GABA. Some people take GABA because it's supposed to be calming for your body and for your brain. Okay? You may not be able to read this, but this guy is a romantic. He says, "You know what's happened, don't you?" to his love. And the cartoon is called I Dated a Biochemist. She said, "Yes, I know what's happening. Your serotonin levels have plummeted, plunging you into a passionate haze in which you deludedly think you're in love with me." Basically saying that the chemicals in our brain are what make us feel all the things we feel. They rule our lives. So the blue one here represents, can you guess? A lot of it deals with schizophrenia. Too little of it causes anxiety. So blue would be dopamine. The green one is serotonin. So low levels of green lead to depression. High levels of green make you feel love. Oxytocin is the love hormone. Over here we have adrenaline and epinephrine as the fight or flight responses. The chemicals in your body make you feel the things that you feel. They're so powerful. If you want to pause this, check yourself. See if you can do this about your notes. Which neurotransmitter helps you move, feel full, or satiated? What neurotransmitter makes you feel less pain? There could be a couple answers for that. Which ones make you feel good? There can be 2 or 3 answers to that. Make you feel relaxed, at least 1 answer for number 5. And there are 2 that help you with your memory. One that helps you with your muscle memory, and one that helps you with learning. Pause it, see if you can answer these on your own. Here are the answers for you, okay? Make sure you can do these without your notes, please. Let's move on, talking about neurotransmitters. So what exactly do drugs do, Mr. Jones? How do drugs relate to neurotransmitters? Well, okay, here's what's happening in your brain before a drug, okay? It's like in your brain normally, we have these little chemicals, neurotransmitters. They're in the synapse right now, and look, this one is binding with a dendrite to make a neuron fire. So drugs can do 2 things. Some drugs are what we call agonists. Agonists, they mimic, or in other words, is they copy neurotransmitters. They do the same thing. So if I took this blue drug here, it is acting as an agonist for my green neurotransmitter. So the drug can make neurons fire. This is an excitatory drug. It is making the neuron fire more, okay? The other thing drugs can do is they can block neurotransmitters from doing their job. We call these the antagonists. I put in parentheses there, the bad guys, right? In language arts, antagonist is the bad guy. So these yellow drugs, what they do is they bind to the postsynaptic neurons dendrites in order to prevent the green neurotransmitters from actually doing their job, okay? So this neuron is never gonna fire now like it normally would because the dendrite receptors are being blocked or capped by these antagonist drugs. That's what drugs do. They mess with your brain, they mess with your body because they impact whether or not neurotransmitters can do their job. Okay? So think about this. This is like really high level, tough questions. Would a drug be an agonist or antagonist if it causes schizophrenia? And what you should be able to do here is, first off, you need to figure out, okay, what chemical does this thing? So like number 1, what chemical causes schizophrenia? I'm looking back at my notes. I'm seeing that, oh, too much dopamine causes schizophrenia. Okay, so now I can answer, well, if a drug causes schizophrenia, is it copying dopamine? Is it acting like dopamine? Or is it blocking dopamine? So for number 1, I would say that the drug would be an agonist, and if you want to be specific, it would be an agonist for dopamine if it causes schizophrenia. Okay, so for number 2 through 6, you can use your notes for this, but link back and try and figure out, would this drug, if it does this thing, would it be copying a neurotransmitter, or would it be blocking a neurotransmitter from doing its job? Okay, we'll go over that in class. Let's talk about specific types of drugs. The reason why drugs can impact your brain. So normally chemicals in the body, they don't actually impact your brain. So if you have what's called a blood-brain barrier, it's this web of blood vessels that protect the brain usually. But drugs are so small and sneaky that they can get through these blood vessels into your brain. We're going to talk about 4 categories of drugs. Hopefully these are familiar to you. Not too familiar, but hopefully you're familiar with them. So we can kind of move quickly through this. Stimulants. To stimulate means to increase your alertness, your brain activity, okay, your arousal. Stimulants are often addictive. They make you feel good, euphoria, euphoric, but then you will crash afterwards, right? They diminish your appetite. They mess with your dopamine and serotonin. So most common stimulants, caffeine, number one, for all my coffee addicts out there. You are addicted to a stimulant, a psychoactive drug. Nicotine, probably the next most common one. And then you have some of the biggies, cocaine, meth, ecstasy can work as a stimulant, meaning it gets your brain activity increased. Second category, depressants. Okay, this is tricky. Depressants don't make you depressed. They don't make you depressed. They depress your nervous system, meaning they slow down your thinking, right? People get confused because alcohol is the most common depressant, but some folks are like, alcohol doesn't make people depressed. Alcohol makes them louder, more outgoing, make them more annoying. They don't seem depressed. Remember, it doesn't make you depressed. It depresses your thinking, meaning it slows down your thinking. So you do things you would not normally do when you drink because it's slowing down your brain. Other depressants, opiates, okay? We said that endorphins are your body's inner morphine, the things inside your body that make you feel good. Opiates are agonists for those endorphins. They make your body feel good. You feel less pain than you would otherwise, which of course means it's incredibly addictive, okay? And your brain can no longer, that's why people who have a withdrawal from heroin or from codeine, they have such a tough time because by taking these drugs, they are preventing their brain and body from producing the natural chemicals that make you feel good and allow you to take care of yourself, okay? Barbiturates, also known as tranquilizers, make you fall asleep. Okay? If you overdose on tranquilizers, that can knock you out, knock you into a coma because these induce sleep. So these are the depressants. Number three, hallucinogens. Very trippy. Hallucinogens make you hallucinate, meaning they make you sense things, either seeing or hearing things that aren't actually there. So the most common ones, LSD, MDMA, also known as ecstasy, which we mentioned as a stimulant as well. Any sort of shrooms, the active chemical is psilocybin. Those are hallucinogens, and that's what they do in the brain. They make your sensory cortex think that things are out there that are not actually there. Finally, this whole slide dedicated to cannabis, marijuana, THC. This is unique because marijuana can be a hallucinogen. It can also be a depressant. It can also be a stimulant. So there are different strains of marijuana that act differently on different people, okay? And I know that some people say that they use marijuana because it helps them relax, but what the research actually shows is that using marijuana, it's not as innocent as it may seem, okay? It can actually increase the likelihood that you develop anxiety, that you develop depression, that you develop schizophrenia. So for folks who have already been diagnosed with these things, sometimes a doctor might prescribe them marijuana to help them with their anxiety and depression. However, if you are healthy and you are not experiencing anxiety and depression, it can be very risky for you to start using marijuana, to start using cannabis, because you don't know what it might do to your brain. So what I always recommend, you'll hear me say this, and if you look at the letters around my classroom, don't do drugs until you're 25. Because at that point, your brain is fully developed. You can do whatever you want to your brain after 25. But right now, while you're 16, 17, 18, your brain is still developing. And taking in a chemical substance, even something that people may not think is that dangerous, right? Taking in a chemical substance while you are 16, 17, 18, it can impact the way your brain produces chemicals your body needs, okay? So be careful about that. Don't do drugs until you're 25, okay? After you're 25, do whatever you want, but I want your brain to fully develop first so that you can be happy and healthy throughout your whole life as much as possible, okay? That's my goal for you. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So positive things about marijuana that have been researched, it can help deal with symptoms of pain, spinal injury, folks who are going through chemo, folks who have AIDS, it helps with those symptoms, right? So that is the reason that cannabis could be prescribed. But do be aware that it can impact your ability to form memories, to recall information, and it can also impact your movement. So really powerful THC, powerful chemical substance. Okay? The last little section for today, and hopefully these are some familiar terms for you, but what is happening in the brain when someone experiences addiction? Okay, and this is addiction to anything. It could be addiction to a drug. It could also be your addiction to your smartphone or your social media apps. You can be addicted to a person, right? So what's happening in your brain? So the dopamine reward pathway, okay? So limbic means having to do with your emotions, and dopamine is that chemical that makes you feel pleasure. The dopamine pathway is what makes you feel addicted. So first we have two types of dependence. You have a mental dependence. You think you need the thing. And then you also have what's called a physical dependence, which is when your body actually needs that chemical because it has stopped producing neurotransmitters and chemicals on its own. So it has to have this external outside drug for it to function properly, okay? Really dangerous. So what happens when a person stops using a drug after their body has become dependent on it? We have what's called withdrawal symptoms. If you know someone who's tried to stop smoking or tried to give up caffeine, or if you ever miss your coffee in the morning because you're running behind and you just try to go to school, you might have headaches, you might shake a little bit, it might impact your heart rate and your breathing. Those are withdrawal symptoms. That means that your body is physically dependent on the drug. Tolerance is when, with alcohol, the first time someone has alcohol, it really impacts them. But by the 10th time they have alcohol, or over the course of several years, if they drink more and more and more, like in college, when people start drinking when they're 21, well, by the time they're 22, 23, 24, they have an increased tolerance for alcohol, right? It takes more alcohol to create the same effect that they used to maybe feel or have after a single drink, okay? So that's called building up a tolerance. It's another sign that you have become dependent on this thing, and it is very tied to addiction, okay? So check for understanding here, test yourself here. Number 1 and 2 are about drug use, and then number 3, 4, and 5 of those concepts we just talked about, which concept do you think is evident here, okay? Quiz yourself, we'll go over the answers in class. Make sure you can identify the different types of neurotransmitters, as well as the different categories of drugs and what's happening in the body when people use those drugs. So I'll see you in class.